G'day, I'm reacting today to the sin of empathy. So, a video popped up in a group that I'm in of Australian Presbyterians, a Facebook group, and it was a conversation between Joe Rigney and Albert Mohler about Joe Rigney's new book, The Sin of Empathy. So, I watched that and then I Googled The Sin of Empathy, or YouTubed, if that's the verb, and found his conversation with Douglas Wilson. So I watched both of those videos, or most of the Douglas Wilson conversation and all of the Mohler-Rigney conversation. And I wanted to react to this concept and then what they were talking about a little bit, and then use it as a jumping off point to more reactions or more thoughts. In a way, to summarize everything, or to summarize my reactions at the beginning, the phrase is clickbaity. So they're using the phrase in a sort of clickbaity way, and I think the direction that Mohler takes it in is as a sort of a cultural catch-all term. Doesn't work. And then Douglas Wilson's also taking it in a sort of different direction to do with emotional intelligence. So that's my descriptions of what those two conversations are doing. And you don't really get to explaining the phrase or getting to the bottom of how sin is, how being empathetic or empathy is a sin. And I think the phrase, as it's sort of, because there's the way in which the phrase is used sort of in a popular way, and then there's what Wilson, Mohler, and Rigney mean by it, and then there's the sort of the underlying issues or the underlying topics, and I think that's the most interesting part, is the discussion that this phrase provokes. The sin of empathy provokes a really interesting discussion about a number of important topics, and so to sort of summarize, I think that the key. So what Mohler's doing is sort of a synonym for the problem of wokeness, and then what Wilson's doing is, hey, there's all these weird dynamics in pastoral ministry, and that scaled up is a problem for evangelicalism or reformed evangelicalism. They're the phrases he uses in the video. And so I think there's a deeper, more interesting discussion about what empathy is, emotional intelligence, and the way in which emotions, that the role they play in our identity. And so just to start off, I'll probably play a couple of clips, sort of representative clips from Mohler first, the Albert Mohler, Joe Rigney discussion, and just to highlight the way in which Mohler and Rigney, but particularly interestingly, Albert Mohler, and I don't think I'd ever heard a video. I've kind of have a sense of who he is, but I'd never actually listened right through to a video of his, and very much a culture warrior, sort of a culture wars type of approach. So empathy is this sort of cultural problem. So I'll find a clip and drop it in here that illustrates that.
Yeah, so let's do a history of ideas approach to this. And you mentioned the coinage of the term somewhere in the early 20th century, likely from a German source.
Yeah.
A lot's going on then. So I mean, that's not a moral vacuum.
Right.
A lot's going on then. You mentioned the idea that sympathy and perhaps even compassion is seen as a representation of a dominant condescension to a subordinate.
Yes.
And with the theories of the age, especially the kind of artificial egalitarianism and all the rest, that becomes a problem. But it seems to me there's more to it than that. I want to just test this with you. It seems to me that you can't separate this from the secularization of the self. that took place in the modern age, and by the way, shows up in so many ways, including the rise of psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud, Maslow. You go down the list. What you do becomes, and who you are becomes abstracted from what you feel and how you project yourself.
That's exactly right. I think, in Carl Trueman's work on, the self and the modern self, he actually draws attention to this sort of idea of the elevation of empathy as a way of getting in touch not only with your own self but with other selves, but like you said, abstracted or denatured. You're not actually tethered. We see this, the apotheosis of this, of course, is in the transgender movement, where your feelings have no tethering to your bodily embodied reality. But whatever I feel, you must affirm, and if you don't affirm it, you're heartless and cruel, and you're bad. You're an evil person for not affirming my feelings, and that's sort of the end result of it. But there's all kinds of gradations, long before that are much smaller, but still steering wheels.
Yeah, one of the things I often try to point out is that obviously worldviews have consequences, but if you deal with the actual things get clarified. So if you take a Occupy, New York protester, and you take a suburban Christian housewife, and you present them with a child in need of clothing and water and food, I think they're going to know exactly what to do. They're going to clothe that child. They're going to feed that child. They're going to give that child water. The difference is when the left creates an abstraction, which supposedly represents every child in the world and every need of every child in the world, and then proposes that that's where we shift our moral reasoning, that becomes a huge problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why the left doesn't have children, because instead, all the children of the world are theirs.
Yeah, it's the old Dostoevsky and Brothers Karamazov illustrates this. The person who, I love humanity, but it's people I can't stand. It's the near and the clear and the obligations there, that actually would require something costly to make it abstract and to make it a kind of class. There's this generic group that's now been identified that becomes sort of the animating principle, and becomes, and Christians again go, well, I want to care. I want to be a caring person. And so whatever I have to do to show myself, to prove myself a caring person, I will do it. And I think that's why a lot of churches and ministries went along with a lot of folly for a long time, because it was about demonstrating their compassion to the satisfaction of progressives. So there's an entire chapter in the book called "Life Under the Progressive Gaze" that describes how this happened as Christians came to have a little censorious progressive over their shoulder, evaluating whether they were being caring enough, and by doing so, all sorts of things shifted, and we think of it often as drift. It's theological drift. It's actually being steered.
And then I think Wilson, he starts in a different place. So he's talking to Joe Rigney, and I imagine, I need to double check the dates on these videos, but I assume it's part of a book tour. And because I also found when I was Googling it that Joe Rigney, this is based on a book. So he's written a book with that title. And so perhaps these interviews are part of that. And Wilson wants to talk about the way in which he starts with pastoral situations and the dynamic inside a pastoral situation. And he distinguishes between, hey, you want to be sympathetic in a pastoral situation, but not empathetic. And if you're too empathetic, then you sort of get drawn in, you lose your objectivity. And it becomes this, and that pastoral dynamic, argues Wilson, and Joe Rigney agrees with him, that pastoral dynamic then scaled up is a problem. So I'll find a clip that sort of conveys that sense as well.
Yep. Well, we walked into that in the world of counseling, because I go in, I pay my money to this trained counselor, and I think that he's supposed to be on my side. He's supposed he's supposed to believe me. And the person I just accused of rape, or the person I just accused of molestation, there's nobody on his nobody on his side.
Not in that room, yeah.
Not in that setup.
Right.
And of course, if the story is true, then we're not going to shed any tears for the guy who's actually guilty of that. But at a fundamental level, we do not yet know who is the victim.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, so in principle, it might be possible for a really sturdy counselor to operate in a system like that, where someone's coming in and paying them for help. But it would have to be the sort of thing where, from the outset, they're saying, okay, you're coming in here and asking for help, which means in order to help you, to actually help you, I have to reserve a certain kind of emotional distance from you, and I need to be able to evaluate and assess the whole thing. And so if you're looking just for someone to be on your team, this isn't going to work. And and that would have to be kind of set up from the get-go, so that you don't pull that out halfway in and they say, hey, wait, you're changing the rules of the game.
Right. You can't ever commit to being automatically
on their side.
On their side in the dispute. And in pastoral counseling, I try to say there are three sides involved here. There's, like in marriage counseling that you were describing, there's the husband's perspective, and there's the wife's perspective, and then there's Christ's perspective.
Yes.
And rarely do I see Christ's perspective map onto
Yeah.
the husband's or the wife's.
In toto. Right.
Precisely.
Straight across.
And a minister is supposed to be there as the representative of Christ, someone who's steeped in his word, who understands biblical law, biblical principles, and who will bring them to bear on this situation. But he's there not with the wife as a client or the husband as a client, but Christ as Lord.
Right, and when you have, so in a healthy church setting, I think if you have people who are in principle committed to that, you can make a lot of progress. Because even if there's a subtle demand for empathy in a setting like that, you can always draw them back to first principles, where you're saying, well, now hold on, I'm not here to pick sides. I want to help, right? And picking sides actually might be more harmful. But if that's been undefined, or if that's not clear at all, then you get there's escalation when the misunderstandings happen, because all of a sudden I thought you were on my side, and then all of a sudden you started asking me questions or probing in certain ways that I wasn't comfortable with, and you reserve that emotional distance, and the accusation is going to be something like, you're not showing empathy, you're not being empathetic.
Now, I think thinking about this topic at a sort of a low resolution view, from 30,000 feet, or thinking about this phrase as it's been thrown around in this particular discussion group that I'm a part of, it feels as though at a high level, at a low resolution perspective, you can be tempted to think, being empathetic is a problem. And you could kind of get that sense, and maybe I needed to watch the end of the video between Wilson and Rigney, but I kind of got the sense that you could come away with a superficial understanding that empathy was a bad thing, that sympathy was okay and empathy was a bad thing. Someone actually wrote a comment in the Australian Presbyterians group that I'm a part of, along those lines, that it's okay to be sympathetic. The parable of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan was sympathetic, but you don't want to be empathetic. There's no justification for empathy, according to this particular comment, and so that's the sense that you get from Wilson's conversation with Rigney, and in a way, my first reaction is that it's clickbaity. This phrase, the sin of empathy, is clickbaity. It feels, the way that it's being used is it's a sort of a political signal. So it's a shibboleth is a sort of a password. You say the correct password and you're allowed into the tribe, or you're allowed past the boundary. But also, you can have a particular signal and people often use the phrase pejoratively, like dog whistle. But it's sometimes you do want to signal to your political tribe. You want to say, hey, I'm part of this in a discussion or in the discourse. You want to say, I'm part of this group, and you want to signal, I'm saying the particular phrases, or I'm identifying, villainizing a particular person, or reinforcing a particular message, because you're trying to signal something to your own group. And then sometimes you're signaling to other groups that you're not part of them, that you belong, and that whole, the way, that's a fascinating topic, and it needs its own video, the way in which, and I guess that's part of what propaganda is, but it can also be a legitimate thing where you legitimately want to signal to your tribe that you're on their side, or you want to signal to the other tribe that you're not on their side. I'll put a link. Which side am I going to put this on? Maybe this side here of the video. I'll put a picture up and a link down below to the Mooks and Knight article, the Internet of Beefs, and I almost need that meme, tap the sign meme, and tap the Internet of Beefs article which is this sort of deep dive, really fun, you should read it, sort of analysis of the way internet discourse works, the sort of political back and forth, the argy-bargy. And so at a surface level, saying, the so-called sin of empathy is a signal. And I'm, perhaps because I don't quite understand it at that surface level, I think perhaps I'm not quite in that tribe. I'm not understanding it correctly. And so, and to be precise, to be careful, I looked up the definitions of the phrase, and I just Googled the definitions, and Google says sympathy is feelings of pity, sorrow for someone else's misfortune. So this is the way people ordinarily use these phrases. Sympathy, feelings of pity for someone else's misfortune, and then empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And I guess there's a bit of a spectrum, a good spectrum between sympathy, because you'd need to understand someone's misfortune, and empathy, where you've had the same emotional experience, or you have the same emotional reaction. And so that's how people kind of use the terms ordinarily, at an ordinary level. And then sort of going a little bit deeper, before we just go one step deeper, in the Moeller Rigney video, Rigney says, I'm using the phrase provocatively because, he doesn't actually say, sometimes you need to be empathetic. I think he says at one point, you should show compassion and be loving, etc., etc. So he doesn't want to say, I'm not saying, being loving is sinful, or being compassionate is sinful. I'm saying, too much of it is a problem. And that's right, John Calvin says our hearts are idol factories. You can make anything into an idol, both something you fear or something revolting into an idol, but you can also make something good into an idol. As long as it replaces God, it's an idol. If it does something that God should be doing for you, then it's functionally an idol. So functionally, and that's the replacing God is the heart of sin. So any emotion or any sort of emotional aspect or aspect of our personality can be turned by our sinful hearts into sin. So you got to guard against that, of course, yes. But it doesn't seem like that's a major problem. I mean, society is full of problems. The human condition, we continually invent problems, and we recycle and reuse previous problems. So we're not... There's the thing that this empathy is the sin of empathy phrase is at a surface level seems to be saying, oh, there's a new problem. People are being empathetic or being too empathetic. There's too much empathy, and it's causing this real problem. Going back to the Moeller Rigney interview, it's the maybe even the cause of wokeness, or it's this part of the it's this big cultural problem. So it's not just a pastoral problem. It's this explanation that explains all these type of things, and in a way it's a bit over-realized. So over-realized eschatology is when when you think about the Bible and all the predictions for Judgment Day and life with God and the kingdom's all now. It's not a sort of bit of now and not yet. It's all, the kingdom's all now. Everything's all now. Over-realized eschatology. Eschatology is end times, the future. So everything is now over-realized. And in a way, it's a sort of a little bit, using the term like that's a little bit over-realized. It's it explains all these different things culturally and pastorally, and explains too much when it's used too generally. And there's another, so to grab my previous thought, so if you kind of move past the political signaling, the sort of clickbaity title, it's interesting that, and this came up in the Australian Presbyterians group, the Facebook group that I'm a part of, another argument is, well, it's not biblical. We don't see that phrase. And this is an interesting argument. This argument pops up. Before I get into this, I should preface it by saying I think the impulse to use biblical language, to use biblical phrasing, to think biblically is a good one. We want to use the early church as our measure of what church looks like and relationships look like. But we can't undo all of history. God has been at work in history. So yes, he's given us the Bible and first century church, but he also gave us then 2,000 years of church. So we don't destroy all of 1,800 years of 900 years of church and just go back. We use the original as a measure, and so in a sense, biblicism is good. Proof texting is good. We want that constant reference back to Scripture, but we also want to be able to say, well, God's been at work in history. God's the author of history, and humans think about ideas, debate, discuss, and turning over truth since the Word came into the world. We're still following and thinking about truth now, and we'll continue to do so into the future. So where am I going with that? Yeah, biblicism. So there's this funny reaction, this sort of biblicism. I'm using that term pejoratively in this sense, but I think there's a place for it, where you say, oh, empathy, the word empathy is not in the Bible. And the problem with that is that's a tool, that argument is used by those that don't like the Bible. That this particular thing isn't mentioned in the Bible, therefore it's okay. So sort of people attacking the Bible say, well, this particular sin or this particular situation is not mentioned in the Bible, therefore the Bible doesn't apply to this situation. And it's like we take the principles of Scripture and we apply them to the situation that we're in. That the principles of Scripture apply to everything, and then from the other side, you can kind of get this, so that non-Christians might say that, but then Christians might get themselves tied up by thinking, oh, this particular phrase comes up with the Trinity. So you think, oh, that phrase, the word Trinity, the phrase, the Trinity, or the word Trinity is not in Scripture. And you say, well, it's shorthand. It's shorthand for describing how God works, the relations between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but three persons but one being, describing that dynamic. And so you use shorthand. And maybe over the next 2,000 years we'll discover a better shorthand than Trinity. Well, that seems like a pretty good word. And so we've kind of agreed on that collectively as the best sort of shorthand. And so I'm not convinced by the argument that just because the word doesn't appear in Scripture, therefore we we can't use it, or therefore it's a problem, or therefore it's not a good thing. And so that's the sort of the more surface level reactions. But I think one before I go a bit deeper, Rigney defends the title in the Moeller video by saying, Don Carson, the great Don Carson, evangelical scholar, thought a lot about culture, was reacting to early postmodernism, and wrote a book called The Intolerance of Tolerance, sort of describing the way in which sort of early 90s or late 80s, that sort of reaction to modernity said, all narratives are equally valid. We've just got to tolerate everybody's viewpoint, tolerate everybody's narrative, except we can't tolerate the one narrative that says it's the true narrative. And so that's what Don Carson was trying to do with that title, sort of to highlight the hypocrisy of that. And Rigney argues that he's trying to do the same thing as Carson. Now, I don't think he quite does it, because Carson's highlighting a dynamic there that's misplaced. But the whole phrase, taken at face value, the sin of empathy, isn't true, because empathy isn't sinful. Like, there's to now use the argument of biblicism, there's no direct condemnation of empathy in the Bible, and empathy itself as a understanding someone's pain is a good thing. And so, and anything, it's almost an overgeneralization or a truism, that's an aphorism that doesn't explain anything, to say that, or it doesn't explain much. And I know this was the point that I made earlier. Anything can be used as a sin. So the sin of empathy as a title doesn't really work, because, or anything can be a sin, yes, but in particular, empathy itself is not a sin. It's can be good. It's you're not sinning if you're showing someone empathy. If you've understood someone's emotional situation, or if you've shared in someone's emotional situation, you're not sinning. And so it doesn't quite work in the same way. It's as a rhetorical device. It doesn't quite have the same, it doesn't function in the same way as Carson's point. You may not be convinced by that, by my argument there, that rhetorically it's not the same. But I think it's worth reacting to. It's worth commenting on. All right, to sort of now switch gears and steelman perhaps a little bit of what Rigney, Wilson, and Moeller are trying to get at, or to go into the more interesting, more helpful discussion underneath. So there's a couple of things going on here. One is the place of disruptive emotions, the nature of empathy, and the way in which emotions and our identity and how we express ourselves work. So there's kind of three really sort of interesting topics that this phrase has provoked. So even if I don't quite understand politically or factionally what it's doing or saying, because perhaps and maybe that indicates because I don't understand, I'm not part of that faction, and I'm not convinced at a surface level that empathy is a sin, because it doesn't rhetorically make sense, and I'm not convinced by the biblicist arguments. I think there's these three really interesting topics, and see if I can remember them. The three topics that I've just said. There's the emotions and identity, the way in which emotions and rationality work in who we are, the nature of empathy itself, and I think there's actually a connection there to the Trinity, and the sort of the way in which sort of emotional intelligence and disruptive emotions work. So let's start with that one, disruptive emotions. There's a really interesting video, and I'll play the whole thing. It's only like 5 minutes or something, by Andrew Wilson. No, sorry. why did I say Andrew Wilson? Alistair Roberts. Those names sound similar in my brain. Alistair Roberts, British theologian, online a lot. You may have come across him if you Google him. I think he's associated with the. Yeah, if you Google him, you'll see who he is, and so he pops up occasionally in my Twitter. I think I follow him on Twitter and in videos and podcasts and things like that. But he's released this fantastic video about the theorist, I think it's a family systems theorist, a couple of videos about the family system theorist that Joe Rigney is referencing, or that Joe Rigney's used to talk about in his book, The Sin of Empathy. And there's a fantastic video, I'll play the whole thing in just a moment, about the way in which someone's disordered emotions can then disrupt a group. That's probably a better way of saying it. So someone's disordered emotions can disrupt a group. So I'll play that video now.
The following reflection was first published on the Anchored Argosy. It's entitled Characteristics of Dysfunctional Communities. I have previously commented upon some contemporary uses of the work of Edwin Friedman. In my previous discussion, I noted the way that Friedman's analysis had been heavily gendered by some subsequent interpreters, in ways that it was not in Friedman's own work. Admittedly, this later gendering should not be entirely surprising, given the prominence of the term empathy in parts of Friedman's account. While the term empathy might have the effect of foregrounding more commonly feminine relational impulses, Friedman's analysis of dysfunctional communities clearly also applies to dynamics more typical of male-dominated groups. Consequently, if we allow the gendered weighting of the term empathy to direct our attention too much, we can miss much of the application of his work. Indeed, in some respects, we may even become more susceptible to some of the problems he identifies. Friedman explores the way in which dysfunctional communities can come to order themselves around their most disruptive, demanding, immature, and unself-regulated members, as leaders lack the nerve, will, character, support, or capacity effectively to stand up to them. In such situations, the expectation can be that the family, group, or society bend over backwards to appease, accommodate, avoid offending, or coddle the dysfunctional member or members. It is easier to expect everyone to change around the disruptive persons than to confront those persons and provoke their displeasure. In many places and institutions within our society, as well as in many churches and Christian organizations, this dysfunctional herding dynamic is typically encountered in more feminine modes. However, it can be no less operative in more masculine-coded forms and contexts. While feminine groups may be more susceptible to such herding dynamics that depend upon appeals to empathy, there are several other ways that they can operate. It can, for instance, take the form of appeasement strategies designed to avoid confrontation, insistence upon unity in response to bad behavior being challenged, pressure upon and blaming of those who expose or challenge it, and lots of effort being expended to justify, minimize, or excuse it. Rather than appealing to empathy, the disruptive person might get their way through intimidation and violence, through creating a scene or throwing a tantrum, by making life deeply unpleasant and tense for everyone around them when opposed, through constant taking of umbrage and offence, through spreading complaints and bitterness, through spreading distrust and accusations about leaders, or through exciting division and conflict in the ranks in other ways. Faced with such people in a society, organization, church, or family, the easiest course will often seem to be that of giving them their way, making excuses for them, and resisting anyone who would unsettle the situation by standing up to the disruptors. Anyone who challenges the most immature and dysfunctional group members can be characterized as divisive. It is easier to silence such voices than to put the dysfunctional and immature parties in their place, which could easily result in elevated internal conflict. The tensions created by such a situation will typically be displaced onto others. There will be those who constantly must try to defuse tensions through humor. Others will make sophisticated excuses and rationalizations for the disruptors. Others may attack any who challenged the disruptors and shift the blame for any unpleasantness caused by the disruptors onto them. many will be walking on eggshells around the disruptive figures or flattering them in various ways. So much of this results from conflict-avoidant desire for in-group unity, often accompanied by raised external conflict to channel internal tensions, association of apology with weakness, an urge to appease and cover for dysfunctional and restive group members and elements. Groups that adopt such an approach often have genuinely mature and gifted people within them, yet their incapacity to exercise decisive self-regulation and policing means that they will constantly be waylaid by their loud and immature elements. One of the effects and symptoms of such a regressive dynamic is that entire families, institutions, movements, groups, churches, denominations, societies, etc. become ordered around and known for their most immature and dysfunctional members, behaviors, and actions. As such groups continue to accommodate and adapt themselves to their disruptive elements in various ways, their entire character will gradually become colored by those of their immature and disruptive members. In such settings, people who could be smart, respected, and good leaders within well-regulated organizations and societies can end up devoting their reputational capital, time, and energies to providing intellectual cover and excuses for fools, and for foolish actions and statements that people lack the maturity to retract. Recognizing this, it might be diagnostically helpful to ask which figures are most dominant in our own group's public profiles, what sides of them are most prominently displayed, and what and who our public discourse most amplifies. If the most dominant figures are fools, provocateurs, and even vicious people, and our groups are constantly rallying to provide intellectual cover and excuses for dumb incendiary statements, imprudent or sinful actions, and immature or bad persons, it is a strong indication that we have a serious problem. Internal criticism, retraction of bad statements, apology for wrong or imprudent actions, discipline for unruly parties, etc., are all ways that we can protect ourselves from becoming tethered to folly and evil, enabling us and our communities to put our best feet forward. If you would like to read this and other reflections, you can do so on the Anchored Argosy, the Substack that I share with my wife. If you would like to support my work here, there, and elsewhere, you can do so using Patreon or PayPal. The links for those are below. God bless, and thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, in that way of thinking, that way of thinking about this topic is important, because if someone has disordered emotions, and I'm saying disordered because sometimes disordered emotions can be, well, generally they're presented strongly, but sometimes they can be more subtle, but they aren't either appropriate to the situation, or if you evaluate them, they're the end result of them is somehow disruptive in a bad way, and I mean morally bad, to the group. And so assuming the group has a good purpose, the group is a good thing, thinking about a church or thinking about a family that is heading in roughly the right direction that it should, and then or a particular group that's doing something good and heading in a direction that is healthy and good, then sort of someone with disordered emotion can disrupt that group, disrupt the church setting, disrupt something. And that, if I can see in a way that this debate around the sin of empathy, the things that these guys are in the videos are talking about, you can see that this is, if this is what they're thinking of, then this is helpful to think about. This is helpful to confront. When I think about disruptive people in a church setting, I think of Ezekiel 34, where the fat sheep bully the mean sheep. I'll put the verse up here, and you can look up Ezekiel 34, and it's in the context of an oracle of judgment against Israel, ancient Israel's leaders, for so it's putting the exile of the Jewish people into context by saying, hey, your leaders let you down and your leaders behaved as bad shepherds, allowing the mean sheep to disrupt the more vulnerable sheep. So jumping into verse 20 of Ezekiel 34. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says to them. See, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep, because you shove with flank and shoulder. So these are the mean sheep, shoving with flank and shoulder, butting out all the weak sheep with your horns until you have driven them away. And then this is God speaking. I will save my flock. They will no longer be plundered. So the flock is vulnerable to outside forces, but then the flock is vulnerable to inside forces. The sheep inside the flock have been disruptive, and God will rescue the flock from outside and inside forces, and from the leaders who are meant to stop this from happening. I will place over them, in verse 23, one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them, and he will be their shepherd. This is sort of looking forward to the coming of Jesus. And I will be the Lord their God, and my servant David will be a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. So I often think about that analysis by the prophet Ezekiel of the failure of leadership in stopping disruptive people. And that video from Alistair Roberts is just such an excellent summary of that dynamic, a really helpful one. So thinking about the next part of my reaction, the next theme that's brought up by this topic. So that if that first reaction, I'm sort of steel manning, if that's what they're getting at, I'm on board with that. I don't think calling empathy a sin explains that. I think the way Alistair Roberts is putting it is better. But yeah, if that's what they're getting at, then I'm on board with that. The next thing that I'm sort of taking a different path on is thinking about the topic of empathy itself. And this person commenting on this topic, so they said something about biblicism in this is in the Australian Presbyterian group, and then they said something about the etymology, the sort of genealogy of the idea of empathy being this nefarious, the result being nefarious because it was sort of this Hindu concept of, the dissolution of all boundaries, the loss of sense of self, the sort of merging with others, sort of the Neuralink, the fuzzy spiritual version of Neuralink, sort of mushing and meshing all our minds together. That concept being sort of smuggled in with empathy, or not smuggled in, as this person was saying, and now we've kind of got this term in modern psychology, and Wilson sort of hints at this as well in his interview with Rigney, that we don't want that. We don't want this sort of mind meld. We don't want to lose a sense of identity, and that's what empathy does. That's the and this is the argument that empathy is this sort of, it's promoting this nefarious mushiness between people, and we lose a sense of self where we have to just go with wherever the person's leading, just follow this particular person's emotion. Now, it feels as though like that's asking, like that term's doing a lot, and that's not what people mean ordinarily. So if there's sort of this elite therapeutic term, then that feels, well, where do we see that in the wild, and how would we verify that that's the secret agenda, or that's the nefarious use of this term? That doesn't ring true. I don't see evidence of that. Now, there may be people promoting that out there. There may be some video of someone somewhere, or book of someone somewhere, or a whole therapeutic school that is all about losing your sense of identity and blurring boundaries. And I mean, that's a key idea in sort of Eastern religion, is the ultimate, you move up in enlightenment and you realize you sort of lose a sense of identity, because that's part of suffering, is to have boundaries and distinctions. And so you can see that idea is out there, but is that all in empathy? That doesn't quite feel like that. And so empathy is a useful term, just taken ordinarily. You sometimes understand how someone's feeling, and sometimes you've had the same experience as someone's feeling, and sometimes as someone expresses their emotion, you share in their emotion because you're in the same family, on the same team, part of the same church. You like them, you agree with them, and you may change your mind later, and that's kind of totally okay. So there's a usefulness to empathy, and I think this is the reaction. Before I talk about empathy and the Trinity, just to talk briefly and react briefly to the way Douglas Wilson was sort of commenting on it. I think what he meant to be talking about in the first half of the video, when he was talking about empathy in a pastoral setting, is emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, the way I understand it, is kind of, there's sort of 3 quadrants, or maybe there's 4, and I'm not emotionally smart enough to know what's in the 4th quadrant. But the first quadrant is your own emotions, and you're sort of aware of how you feel, and then how to regulate your own emotions. And then the next quadrant is being aware of other people's emotions and knowing how to respond in appropriate manners, in ways that are sensible and appropriate, or good. And then I guess there's a 3rd quadrant where you're aware of the emotions of the group, and you're aware of how the group is thinking and feeling, and what the vibe of a group is, and how to either direct it or be apart from it or be involved in it. And I feel like there should be a 4th quadrant, but when I learn more, I'll figure out what that is. And I think that's what Wilson's trying to get at, but mistakenly using empathy as a to describe that, and it doesn't work. I think what he's actually trying to get at, and the more healthy discussion, the more interesting discussion, is, well, how does that work? How does emotional intelligence work? How does it work to be aware of yourself and then be aware of someone else's reaction, how they're thinking and feeling, and then how to manage the or be a part of or not be a part of the larger dynamic. And so the next reaction, the next thought, is about empathy and the Trinity. So I've got a quote. I need to pause the video and grab my book, because I've got a quote from Catherine LaCugna, a Roman Catholic theologian who wrote about the Trinity, and a quote from Fred Sanders and Andrew Moody. So I'm going to grab those quotes and then I'll come back. All right, I'm back, and I wanted to briefly comment on 2 other aspects, the Trinity and sort of emotional, our emotional identity. So I've got a quote from Catherine LaCugna. She's a Roman Catholic theologian who specialized in the Trinity, and her emphasis was on thinking about Rana's rule. And so the God we encounter in Scripture and history is the same God in eternity. And so she writes this, thinking about the topic of empathy and God sharing God's life with us. The doctrine of the Trinity, which is the specifically Christian way of speaking about God, summarizes what it means to participate in the life of God through Jesus Christ in the Spirit. The mystery of God is revealed in Christ and the Spirit, as is the mystery of love. the mystery of the persons in communion who embrace death, sin, and all forms of alienation for the sake of life. God's self-revelation reveals who God is. Now, not completely and exhaustively, because we're creatures and God is the creator and we're broken by sin. So, filtered that way, yet we can know true information about God because God shares who he is. Now moving to Fred Sanders, who's an evangelical theologian specializing in the Trinity. And his specialty is, let's think about the Trinity in a coherent biblical way. He writes this about the self-revelation of God. It is the step from the plane of history to the transcendent plane of God's identity and character. So this move is about the self-revelation of God. What is required for the success of Trinitarian theology is the conviction that salvation history is an economy not only of redemption, but also of divine self-revelation. So it's not just about God rescuing us from sin, it's about God making himself known, in which God makes himself known in a uniquely direct way. So there's this important idea in Christian thought that the Trinity expresses is that God reveals who he is. So in a way, you can trace the idea of empathy back to this self-revelation of God. It doesn't need to be a sort of a Hindu mind mesh, a loss of boundaries or loss of identity. This idea of sharing and understanding another traces its ideas back to the self-revelation of God. One more theologian. This is Andrew Moody, who's a designer by day and a theologian by night. He says in a blog post about the Trinity, and I'll put a link in the show notes below, the incarnation and mission of Christ function similarly. The incarnate Son provides a progressive revelation of his Father and of his own sonship. The incarnation says that Jesus reveals the Father because he is the eternal Son, yet shows the same Son becoming perfect as a man. The incarnation provides a congruent expression of the Son's eternal sonship. The self-revelation of God reveals who God is, and in the process of that self-revelation, we see at the same time Jesus growing up, becoming a man, learning what it's like to be human, which brings me to Hebrews 4:15-16, and I'm using the NIV translation here deliberately because, they use the word empathy in verses 15 and 16. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet did not sin. So Jesus is able to understand our condition. He experiences and shares in our condition. He's broken like us, has a broken Adamic body, a body like Adam. Yet, in his humiliation, before his glorification, before he's resurrected, and understands what it's like to be tempted, yet remains uncorrupted. So he's broken by sin, yet remains uncorrupted by sin. So he shares in our experience of sin to the point of death, and this is an excellent way of thinking about empathy. This is obviously a unique aspect of Jesus. We are unable to do that because we're not perfect. We're corrupted by sin, and we need the goodness of Jesus to replace that corruption. Yet that's the basis for understanding other people, for sharing in other experiences, is because God shares in our experience. I like how a good controversy will often be able to be traced back to the Trinity, that there'll be some sort of Trinitarian link to something that's particularly interesting or controversial. And then you know that you've hit the third wire. You know that there's something electric, there's something interesting about the controversy if there's a Trinitarian link. Last thought, Jonathan Haidt is known for two ideas: that ethics has a emotional foundation. So he does these tests, he does these surveys where he has someone told a story, an ethical dilemma, and then the person responds to the story. It's often a provocative story, a controversial story, a little story, and then the person justifies their response. And the study focuses on Haidt's work focuses on the way people justify their response to this ethical dilemma. And his work has shown that there's an emotional dimension to our ethical justifications. The other idea that Haidt is known for is the elephant and the rider, which is his way of describing our emotional relationship to our rational side. So the elephant is the emotional side. It goes where it wants to, doesn't really listen to the rider. So the rider justifies where the elephant goes. Or sometimes maybe the rider's able to direct the elephant and our rational side is able to direct our emotional side. But most of the time it's an elephant-rider relationship. And he's trying to get at the relationship in ourselves between, the romantic philosophy and rational philosophy. It's a sort of not just a struggle inside people, it's also a philosophical struggle. How do we reconcile these two aspects of who we are? And so I think this debate is good in the sense that it makes us think about that and think about how do we describe that? Because it's not just merely saying, oh, well, we're all going to be sort of very controlled automatons, because if Jonathan Haidt's work is true, if there's merit to that, then we're not automatons. We're not the emotional dimension to us and therefore groups is way bigger and more and messier than we want to admit, or we know how to describe or deal with. And so I think the sin of empathy doesn't capture that. It provokes us to that phrase, sin of empathy, doesn't capture those dimensions. It helps us think about those dimensions, but doesn't explain those dimensions. It helps us think about the Trinity, but it doesn't bring out and highlight God's self-revelation. Well, they're my thoughts and my comments on the sin of empathy. If you have yours, put them in the comments, or if you want to comment on what I've said, put them in the comments. Till next time. See you later.